we do have a fantastic next panel up. And as you can see, we're joined at Abbey Road in London with Holly and virtually with Matt Toom. The question I've got in front of me is, what does a CEO want and need from their CMO?
So I think what they want is they want insight, they want knowledge, they want external perspectives, they want support and guidance in terms of the decisions and the things that are keeping them up at night. If I use a sort of coaching analogy, it's enabling them to see their limiting factors, their limiting beliefs, the things that are their blind spots. I think that's more what they need. I saw a stat from the PwC recent survey that 40% of global CEOs think that their business is going to be obsolete in 10 years' time if the rate of change continues at the current pace. So there's this race to reinvent. And I think actually the CMO is ideally placed to deliver that and can almost be a bridge to the other functions that can sometimes work in much more of a siloed.
Research over the years talking about levels of relatively high levels of dissatisfaction of CEOs with their CMOs and those kind of things. And you've got to kind of ask why. And, from my perspective, I always think that, and going back to your original question, I think a lot of CEOs sometimes don't know what they want. And I think that can end up in a misalignment between responsibility, then expectation and performance. You've got to really look at the dynamic of, the CEO and the board and really test the appetite for the expectations of being set and almost start to lay out your plan and to test the appetite for that plan even at that stage.
What about relationships that are sort of years in the making, not just a new company, but marketing leaders and their boards who have had, several cycles of activities, and the relationship still has those thorns, there's still rough edges?
It starts off, first of all, in terms of having a place at the table, because there are still CMO roles that you see that don't actually report to the CEO. And then, the question comes, well, is that really sort of a CMO role? So I've built a very strong relationship with my CEO, who, great business leader, very dynamic. But I've gone on a process of educating him in many ways, the impact and the role of marketing, what marketing is these days, how it's used, how you measure it, what is the impact. So I think you've got to look at it as an educational kind of journey. You've got to be prepared to do the education. And I think that paves the way for the understanding of why you need to invest, having a very clear framework for measurement as well. All CEOs or boards want to see data. What's the impact? What's the measurement, on the bottom line, those kind of things.
I think it's the one role at the C-suite actually that has so many different permutations and so many different component parts to it. And you almost have to think, what type of CMO do I want to be and what's going to be most relevant for this business in this economy at this point in our lives. But I think the behaviours and the natural traits that I see in this function by comparison to perhaps a CIO or a CFO, they're much more of a growth mindset and tend to be much more collaborative, very personable, very curious, all brilliant attributes for a board, an ExCo member these days, and actually a brilliant attribute to be a real partner to the CEO. Or 76% of a business's reputation is around their corporate responsibility, and obviously ESG plays a huge part in that. Who's better to have a real lens over that, unless you happen to have a chief sustainability officer or a chief ESG officer, on the company's position in that, and almost to be the guardian and of the business's brand and reputation in the external market, and then ensuring that feeds through to EVP, through to employee comms. So I think it's a really interesting role, and I think that the skill set typically of a CMO is far-reaching.
Fantastic. I'm going to just pause there, Matt, Holly, for any potential questions from the audience. Obviously, we do. Brilliant. One question over here.
Could you expand on the emergence of this chief revenue officer role and where you see, I think you've both referenced it or back referenced it. Why do you think CMOs have fell under that banner?
so many companies have to really think about reimagining themselves and how they position in the marketplace for the next sort of, 2 decades relatively. And I think the role of marketing just becomes so strategic and so important for being able to do that. I think there's those kind of aspects that come into play, but I think for me, on occasions, chief revenue officer and CMO reporting under them may work for some organizations. I've seen very few personally.
I think it also tends to be much more prominent in, where you've got a recurring revenue model, whether that's a SaaS business or an enterprise software business, that tends to be a chief revenue officer. And I think there was a bit of laziness around, to Matt's point, we'll just put marketing under there because it's a growth driver. But thankfully, I'm seeing less of that. And they are two very different skill sets, whether it's a chief sales officer, chief revenue officer, and a chief marketing officer, they are different skill sets. And I think the chief marketing officer is much more likely to be aligned to a, chief commercial officer or a chief customer officer type role. And, it may actually be that, but with a different title, but marketing sits under that. So that's what I'm starting to see more of, the evolution of the role of CMO being called something else, and actually marketing is just one of the facets. Now, does that mean that marketing's come under a different function? I personally don't think it is. I think it's more a recognition of the breadth of the role and the different component parts that sit under that. So if customer success sits separate to marketing, sits separate to brand, or even reputation.
Matt, what one piece of advice would you want the audience to take back to their teams for tomorrow? And Holly, I'll ask you the same question after.
Always ask why, right? And I think that when I say always ask the question why, you can't afford to ever stop. Never sit back and just rest on what you've done, which worked fantastically, 2 years ago, a year ago, or even 6 months ago. Especially in growth environments, you have to keep pushing, and you have to keep, pushing your teams to keep thinking about, well, why, what next? How do we do this differently? Just keep on bringing the outside and bringing it back in, and keep on looking, because things are just changing so fast in the marketplace. Forget
the title, partner with the CEO and bring your skills into that role, and forget the CMO constraints.
And get even closer.
And get even closer to the customer. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Matt, Holly, thank you very much for your time today.